Hello, everybody. Welcome to Southeast Salon. This is the 10th Salon. I believe it's the 6th Salon we've had during lockdown, during the pandemic. We are hosted by the Upper Norwood Library Hub today. We've got some great guests. We're talking about agency and representation in the creative industries tonight. Specifically, in the shadow of Black History Month, in the shadow of October, we're basically trying to talk about this topic, inclusion and diversity and representation and agency beyond Black History Month, with the focus being on, Black Lives Matter, with the focus being on the lockdown and the pandemic, and opportunities that people might have or are taking or missing out because of how the response to the pandemic has been handled. Really quickly, I'd like to introduce our guests for today. First of all, Charlie Dark, founder of Run.Dem.Crew, Run.Dem.Radio. We've got Sade Abdul, who's a director at Deft Space architecture firm. Mark James, who's co-founder of 40% London. Candace Hewitt, who's a corporate sustainability director. And Melina Pone, who is a creative content director. Hi guys, how you guys doing?
Good, thank you.
Everybody's good. Thank you for being with us, everybody. We've got a handful of people from different disciplines all talking about this subject. These buzzwords that we hear all the time in the news: inclusion and diversity, representation and agency, but specifically with creative organizations, creative businesses, people that are working in advertising, media, film, branding, all of these things. And I think there's always a tinge of how this relates to regeneration, how our communities are changing. And there's always a focus on opportunities for young people who might be changing careers, people who are looking for advice, people who are looking for a bit of best practices from people who have a wealth of experience. And we've got decades of experience on the line with us now. I wanted to start just with a general question. With Black History Month behind us, and the lockdown happening, that we're into our second lockdown here in the UK. How was Black History Month different this year? Especially with a focus on the Black Lives Matter movements worldwide and the tenets that make up the Black Lives Matter movements. How was Black History Month different? And what can we take from this year's Black History Month to go further, especially when it comes to highlighting opportunities and best practices for addressing inclusion and diversity in the creative industries? I'll start with you, Sade. We'll just roll the dice. Sade, what do you think?
Well, I guess it's been quite a year politically. So I guess Black Lives Matter this year is different by the very nature of the fact that it's been very political. I actually don't subscribe to just having 1 month to reflect on Black history. It needs to be an ongoing process. It needs to be very much part of the political debate and necessary if any change should happen. It's interesting, I was having a conversation with someone last week about diversity and opening up business opportunities within the borough of Southwark. And it was to a white person. And he quite rightly noted that we've been here before. We have similar conversations, discussions about diversity, opening up opportunities, and it just gets recycled and nothing really changes. So there needs to be a sort of, I say it, there needs to be, but out of that discussion, we were saying there has to be a sort of almost from top down legislation that forces organizations to open up opportunities. I'm talking from the perspective of suppliers and small businesses being able to supply to large organizations. For me, I prescribe to sort of, it's an ongoing discussion. It's not just a month to reflect. It's part of the ongoing political debate to actually bring about positive social impact.
Okay, thank you, Shade. Charlie, let's go to you.
I would personally say, because again, like Sade, I don't really subscribe to the 1 month of celebration, because it should be a constant daily existence. I feel like this year it felt very tokenistic. In fact, I felt there were lots of kind of projects that I saw where I was just like, why are they doing that? You know, that's not solving the problem at all. I think lots of the important conversations that should be happening during a month like Black History Month don't actually happen. I feel there's always a lot of dancing around the actual conversation that needs to be had. And so I think that leads and brews more misunderstanding as well, you know, and from both sides and many different cultures. So I personally Black History Month is my month of rest. I don't engage in any things that are offered to me, because I'm just like, not many of them are actually that interesting, you know. And I feel that for many young creatives, is kind of, they take work during that month because there's almost this feeling of, if I take work during this month, then that will lead on to something else. Yeah. And so they're taking work that maybe necessarily actually is setting them up for failure further down the line in their career, because you're coming in and you're setting the bar very low.
And if I may, sometimes you can sort of see right through that. I got approached with one of my day jobs, I won't mention it or who by, but it was about a project, an opportunity to come to a school and speak. And it was clear in our communications that she was sort of mixing me up with somebody else that she had asked, and there was a rush to get me booked in for the month. So yeah, I feel you. It's, you know, that can be that misstep. Melina, what about you? What are your thoughts on Black History Month, specifically going beyond Black History Month this year specifically?
Yeah, I think so. There's so many ways I could answer this question. So obviously being a non-Black person of color, and advocating a lot for diversity and inclusion, and actually getting more Black creatives in the industry. So I've been working in industry for several years, various roles, producing, directing, content directing. I'm currently running a team at one of the UK's biggest advertising agencies. It's the first time I've ever worked in-house at an advertising agency. So it's been a real eye-opening year for me, being in a pandemic, working from home, facilitating conversations within a structure that is incredibly corporate, that is incredibly white, that is incredibly middle class. So there's been a lot, I would say, that I've observed that's been different this year, but I think it's more because of the perspective that I'm gaining as opposed to the outputs. Because in terms of outputs, it's kind of the same peak that you see on social, the same programming you'll see on BBC One, BBC Two. Like there'll be, you know, like you said, there'll be a bit more tokenism this year because there's been a much more focused narrative around Blackness and Black lives. But for me, what's been really interesting is seeing how the industry and the agency reacted to this moment. I was actually pleasantly surprised at how seriously a predominantly white space took the learnings of what Black history, what Black culture means. Now, it might not have been outward, but I think for me, I was like, it was refreshing to actually see my colleagues, my peers, the HR department, like collectively assemble like newsletters and blast it out to the agency. I thought, do you know what? Even though I don't know how much this is going to mean to people, to me, the fact that people within the company were being allowed and enabled and given a space to show up authentically in their lives, even if it was just for a month, and share with the people that they work with, you know, side by side every day, a little bit about their culture, a little bit about the point of difference, the nuance of their experience. I thought that was really healthy. I've never worked in an agency during the month of Black History Month where internally people have taken it more seriously. So I on a positive note, I want to say that was what was different for me.
Interesting. Thank you for that perspective. Mark, let's go to you. Any thoughts on?
Just for the record, so my background is in education. I've worked the last 20 years in and around Lambeth, whether that's working within settings or working along them. I've seen best practice in Black History Month at schools. I've seen some pretty shoddy, half-baked stuff as well. You know, I love Bob Marley, but I don't necessarily want to hear about him every year. Yeah. But I've also worked in a school with a black head teacher and a curiously diverse staff team where they really have pushed the boat out. And just when we're looking at creative industries, I've also got 2 kids, and obviously I've got a vested interest in ensuring that they're learning the best possible learning out there. But what I am seeing within creative organizations, I think there's a desire for change. But for a lot of organizations, they're kind of, people in the creative industries tend to be quite liberal on the outside, but they don't always know what they need to do, first and foremost. And I think we're in a, Melina, you said, I agree in part with what you said about the tokenism of it, but also I think for some organizations, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. And every time I see something that's in response to it, I think, oh, here we go. They're just doing it because of this. But if you can see that organizations are making an effort, at least putting their hand up and saying we'd like to do something, then fair play to them. Last night we had Steve McQueen and Mangrove. They shifted the news at 10 out of the way, and we had 2 hours of peak time TV devoted to a subject which isn't in the popular vernacular. Most people don't know what mangrove is. Most people don't even know what a mangrove tree is, yet alone about the Mangrove restaurant and about Notting Hill's history. So I thought that was a massive step. Yeah. And I know there's probably a whole heap of people on Facebook and Twitter now complaining that they couldn't watch the news at 10. So I think that, yes, Black History Month should be part of our yearly curriculum in schools and part of our discussion. But I think a lot of positive steps have been made this year. And I think it's about capitalizing on those. Because if we didn't have the events of this year and George Floyd and the demonstrations here in London, we wouldn't have the BBC. I guess, they must have commissioned Steve McQueen a very long time ago, so it's good timing. But we wouldn't have this reaction. And I think it's coming initially from public bodies. The BBC, Sadiq Khan has obviously made his announcement about the Metropolitan Police, which is great. And that will trickle down. And it's about, it's about reaching up and trying to grab those fruits for me.
Thank you, Mark. I hear you talking about disruption and disrupting the system and taking chances and things like that. Mangrove 9 was amazing. I'm definitely going to watch it again when it comes back around. And he's got 4 more. Sorry.
Lovers Rock. Lovers Rock is what I'm waiting for.
He's got 4 more features coming up. I mean, the man is prolific in terms of what he's producing. Candace, all the way from New York City. I'd like to say happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll take it.
What do you think? I know obviously Black History Month in the States takes place in February, the shortest month of the year.
Surprise, huh?
That's never missed on anybody my entire life. But what do you think? Obviously, you got some thoughts on that.
Oh man, well, you guys are dropping some juicy nuggets there. Agree with everyone. This is not about picking one month where you just shove all Black programming or Black conversation into that, right? I think we all recognize that we live in our experiences, all the time. And so we want to be able to bring that into the work that we're doing and into the environments in which we're working. And it certainly is not always easy. I'm joining this conversation with a slightly different perspective in the sense that I haven't been working in a professional environment for some time, although as Jason mentioned, I started my career in advertising. So I was working in that sector, in the media and communication sector, and working with creatives, as a brand strategist and helping sort of bring, marry the creative with the business idea there, right? And what I ultimately, learned along the way is that I wanted to start to have a bit more influence on what was happening in the broader business strategy. Like, how are companies responding to all of these social pressures, the climate issues, the environmental issues that we're facing? How can they do it better? that started to be a question that I asked myself, and was starting to ask clients. And I think that is sort of that journey that I started maybe 10 years ago. I find it really interesting in how it's culminating now in this response that we're seeing a lot of companies take to Black Lives Matter, to all the other array of social issues that we know are dire. I think a part of why we're seeing companies respond a little bit more quickly, a little bit more proactively, a little bit more boldly, is obviously it's certainly there due to the social movements that are persisting, but it's also due to years of insider pushing for these conversations to move forward, and for companies starting to wake up to their own social responsibility from a global perspective. I think if we're talking about extending Black History Month, I think it's important to think about the role of Black history in the broader international context of human rights. And when you start to take it there, you can really understand why this is not something that's time sensitive, right? And why it's an ongoing and pressing conversation that we do have to hold companies accountable to their role, and to bringing folks into the conversation internally. So I love what you were saying, Melina, about seeing and feeling some level of positivity or comfort or inclusivity coming through in the responsiveness or the work that you were saying.
Because what just to add to your point before we move on, but it's not only working in advertising now. Like you said, you started your career. I've been working for about 10 plus years, and I'm in advertising now after being in publishing, in news, in marketing. Like, I've been around houses. The advertising industry is so curious to me, because the bottom line is it's connecting strategy to business objectives. I work in a social space, right? Fundamentally, it comes down to advocacy from your emerging majority. That is why brands care. That is why the industry is paying attention, because they understand now that there is only one platform in your whole kind of creative or marketing or advertising strategy where people want a conversation. They can't just passively be spoken to, like on television or on a billboard. And this is something that I found really fascinating. And I think fundamentally, I say it to them every day: if you don't start having an opinion about this, if you don't start communicating your values around these big talking points that matter to your consumer, let's be real, it's consumption, it's
That's
money,
right.
it's sales. And we care about what you think and what you feel and what your values are as a brand. We care about how you use your platform to propel a narrative that we feel is important. And obviously inclusion, diversity, more autonomy, more agency over the lives of young people and the lives that we're living is so important. And I needed to say that, because I think that for me is how I convince clients to do things that maybe they wouldn't have done before.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else got any thoughts on that? You've given me several things to move on to, but anybody else have any thoughts on that?
It sounds, going around, it sounds very positive. Like, lots of organizations are being proactive in terms of diversity and inclusion. But actually, I'm finding it to be the opposite. I'm finding that, I won't mention any names, I've had a recent conversation with a very large organization working in a very diverse community. And we've talked about what they could be doing in terms of opening up opportunities in the local area. And the person that I was speaking with said to me, well, surely it's about the best person for the job. So I have to then take a step back and say, well, actually, structural inequality plays a huge role in who gets the job. So it's that sort of, we're still having to educate. So it's not, there's some steps, but it's this continual dialogue that still needs to happen.
I heard exactly what you were saying about that earlier, Sade, in terms of, you see that there should be more opportunities from a supplier relationship perspective, companies should be making more inroads for smaller providers, independent, diverse suppliers, and they're not always doing that. But I think I love your point about bringing that language back to, this is about inequality. This is about creating a fair and equitable society, right? These are things, I'll point to the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? Companies are aware, right? They're aware of this language. They're aware of what they're being tasked with in the bigger sense of things. And I think it is important for creatives and anyone interacting with business entities like this, if you are pursuing some level of a social impact or benefit, to be able to speak that language and bring it to them, right? Because you're right, people, still fall back on this sort of mythology around a meritorious society. Certainly that's the case here in the States. And, we do have to bring it back to, well, what is the bigger aim here? What are we trying to achieve? And start to leverage that language, because I think, I guess a part of me feels that as, a Black American, we haven't always had access to that language, right? To be able to encapsulate our needs in language that, unfortunately, the mainstream society can really start to take to heart. So I love that you made that connection.
And for creative people, sorry.
No,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, for creative people who are developing and inheriting a very corporate white space, or a space that they are not, like you said, this goes back to language, it goes back to understanding how to navigate that space just because of your class or your race. And like, if we're talking about having an equal playing field, for me, advocating for other people and knowing what my experience, my vibe, the rooms that I could maybe get into versus the rooms that some of the incredible creative people that I get to work with, kind of bridging the gap between those two spaces and sort of speaking up and speaking out in those spaces is really important as well. And it's been an eye-opening year for me. So I think when you talked about language, and I think it's also about developing the skills to understand how to exist in that space, which is half of the battle. And if you've got somebody that is able to kind of create an opportunity or understand from the way in which we want to bring in new talent, where to find that talent, how to engage that talent, all of this stuff is so important. And I don't see enough of that happening. So, it's important for me when I'm in that position to say, have we looked here? Have we looked at these sources? There's a bunch of communities over here that have incredible talent that we should be looking at. And yeah, I know it's not perhaps the thread that you frequent, but it's important because it's, it's all of that. It's all of that.
Well, Mark, you and I have been having a lot of conversations about building teams, and that is a theme here. What do you think?
I think just looking back, I'm going to just talk briefly about how we got the idea of 40%. When the George Floyd death happened, when the demonstrations happened in London, I remember seeing this flood of black squares everywhere. Everybody had a black square, yeah? Whether sometimes it was individuals posting, so often most companies, let's be honest, most companies had to say something. And there's one particular design agency that we started a conversation with, and they actually said, we in our industry have got work to do. Most companies just threw that black square up, literally like you're putting a pumpkin in your window at Halloween, and that was kind of the end of it. It's like, right, we've got that done. They'll leave us alone now. For us, it created an opportunity because we saw that it's not all cynicism. It's not all companies who don't want to do things. It's a lot of times it's just people that didn't know what to do. So we saw that there is an opportunity to support these companies. Melina, you talked about helping find where the resources are. We went away and we did our research. The 40%, as Jason said, just it came from the census. I was quite surprised. I didn't realize it was going to be that much. But of course, if you look at advertising agencies, if you look at design agencies, you look at architecture practices, yeah, and you look around those offices, you will not, in general, and correct me if I'm wrong, you won't see a diverse workforce. And in conversations that we've been having, people are saying, you know what, Mark, you know what, Jason, we'd like to have a more diverse workforce. We don't get black applicants, yeah? So part of that is about saying, well, how do we find the talent? Because the talent isn't necessarily going through the traditional routes.
Yeah.
You know, your big tech companies might be recruiting from Cambridge or UCL or Harvard or, you know, wherever, but, you know, talent is everywhere. Yeah. And if you're looking at, you know, I went to a very good state secondary school in London. I didn't know what an architect was back then. If I did, I might have had a go. And so for what I would like to see is, how do we bridge it? These companies, ultimately companies are business and they want the best talent. Yeah. If 40% of the talent pool in London comes from a diverse background and your office is not diverse, you might as well take 100 CVs and throw 40 of them in the bin. It's that simple. So there is work to be done in giving these companies access to the talent and supporting the talent to access those companies. So
I also think creative companies have a responsibility to do that.
They do have
too.
a responsibility. Yeah. It's also about demonstrating to those who maybe feel that they don't have a responsibility that actually there's a business case for diversity. It's as simple as that. This is a straight up cold hard cash argument. If you cannot access in a city like London the diverse, you know, races, creeds and colours that live there, then you're not gonna survive. There's plenty of evidence now, particularly coming from the States, about the impact of diversity. So yeah, you know, there are companies out there that want to make change, and what you'll find is further up the supply chain, you know, you might be tapping into bigger brands like Nike or Google. And if you want to be a supplier of Nike or Google, Nike and Google are doing their thing around diversity already, because they have to. They have to. It's not enough for them to just, you know, stick a black square up, or as Nike used to do, build a few basketball courts in Brixton. That's not kicking it anymore. So those companies are acting. Supreme had to pull their finger out. They got caught, you know, they got caught out because they were involved with the Carlyle Group, and they made a big statement about making a donation. So those bigger companies at a corporate level already got plans in place. And sooner or later, that will trickle down to the smaller companies. They're going to have to follow suit, because ultimately they're suppliers to the bigger companies.
It's interesting that you would say business case, because whenever I've had this conversation prior to working in advertising, it was always definitely a moral case for there to be more diversity. But because the majority, you know, for a long time, when I first started in television or in journalism or in broadcasting, I moved around so much because I really wanted to drive an alternative, irreverent narrative, but I kept getting told, but that's not mainstream enough. You know, that's not going to speak to the mainstream. That's not going to speak to the mainstream. We're now what, in terms of, like I said, the emerging majority, in terms of the mixed race majority. It's like, when are you going to stop using that as an excuse in terms of how we identify to culture? And even, you know, a lot of our programming, a lot of our advertising, a lot of the media that we consume is still not representative. But I'm really excited by this idea that, you know, you're saying there's now a business case. And I think holding on to that and making that part of the primary narrative is unfortunately what we're going to have to do. But you cannot deny that anymore. You cannot deny that in so many tiers of it, not just from a cold hard cash point of view, but like I said, advocacy and for people to become your the people that are your mouthpieces for your brands, your companies, whatever you want them to be. It's about driving like a value exchange with people now. People don't really want to identify with brands or agencies or companies that don't have those sorts of policies anymore, which is really exciting.
I mean, this government is a prime example of what a lack of diversity does to your company or organization's productivity.
To your brand.
Your brand, yeah? How effective you are.
Yeah.
It's a great example of what happens if you tap into a small gene pool.
Charlie, can I bring you in? your experience working with brands, having created your own brand that is all about inclusivity. This is my interpretation, having watched Run.Dem develop, just like getting people to do this health and wellness thing that we might not have considered. It's especially becomes relevant in my mind when Ahmaud Arbery was killed. I thought about Run.Dem.Crew. And then you you developed a brand in such a way where it attracted these larger apparel brands and athletic brands. I mean, is there something, can you speak about that in terms of your work and building teams as well?
Well, I started working with brands in the mid 90s. Levi's was the first brand I ever worked with and that was through music. 2006 is when I started Run.Dem.Crew, and I, by that point, had a relationship with Nike, and again through music. But I just kind of came to the conclusion that there was more to a relationship than just 3 pairs of shoes. You know, especially if you want. I think that at that point was the traditional method: redo the basketball court, but don't give them a coach. Send them loads of shoes, but don't give them access to any tracks.
Right.
So my thing has always been, particularly sports brands, entertainment brands, they have a large responsibility to fix up, because they are very responsible for some of the issues that we see amongst young people now. And there's always this thing of like, well, just entertainment, it's not our problem. You know, the music doesn't affect how people feel, and the games don't affect how people act, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of not taking responsibility for the trickle down. And so my work with brands has always been about trying to get them to really realize the impact of, if you make this shoe for £15 and you sell it for 150 and you market it in this certain way, be prepared for that becoming an aspirational item, and so on and so forth. I think one of the hardest problems I have, and what I always say to people is, for people who've grown up in the hood, you are brainwashed by these brands so early that it's almost like they shackle you in their way of thinking and get you at a really impressionable age. So as your mind is developing, you're just suddenly thinking it's all about luxury brands, and my self-esteem and my worth is dependent on what's on my feet and the clothes I'm wearing and what's on my wrist and the car I'm driving and who I'm hanging out with. And so, you know, and I think that's a really hard chain to break, because in my experience, many of the people who work at brands have not come from community. So they don't really understand it. They don't really understand, you know, how it affects people. And, you know, one of my big things when I work with brands is not allowing this cherry picking of culture, where you're like, okay, well, those guys look good in the clothing, so we're going to have them, but we're not going to have you. And it's really hard, I think, now, because brands are very aggressive and their ear is to the ground. And so they snap subcultures up really, really quickly. And I think for many, you know, creatives and young creators in particular, there's this idea that my idea is not good unless I have brand association, you know. And one of my big things with Run.Dem was always been, Run.Dem would have happened, well, Run.Dem was happening without brand involvement, and we were very happy. And it's what I realized is, the more independence you have, where you only work with brands when they can help you do things that you can't already do by yourself.
Interesting.
You know, and also this understanding is that you don't have a relationship with the brand. You have a relationship with individuals who work for the brand. And that is really different as well, because I think a lot of young people, you know, who get into this game, it's very easy to get seduced by someone who's telling you they have power, but work in the post room, you know. And so actually what happens is you suddenly find out that this relationship with this brand suddenly ends because someone's jumped into another department, and so on and so forth. But I just think, I think it's hard navigating, working with brands in this day and age. But what I really feel is, I started working with brands because I was fed up with doing Arts Council forms. That's why I started working with sports brands, you know, because I realized Olympics are coming and they've got cash. then you suddenly work with sports brands and they're telling you, well, we've only got a budget of £50,000. You know, we haven't got very much, but then you know that the drinks budget is 100,000.
Mm.
Then you sit in on the government meeting, you know, and they're like, we haven't got very much money. We've only got £1 million to spend on the project. And so actually what I realize now is it's kind of about being really fluid and almost looking at your project as like a Formula One car. So you're imagining that you're Lewis Hamilton. So it's kind of, who am I giving the wheels to? Who gets the petrol contract? Who gets the tail fin? Who gets the aerial? Who gets the helmet glass? Who gets the inner liner? Who gets the seat? And so on and so forth. And not putting your eggs in one basket and making sure that all the brands that you work with will play nicely with each other. Because otherwise what you'll find is you'll do great work on a Monday and undo that work on a Friday. And sometimes that work cannot be undone.
Shout out to Lewis Hamilton making history.
Shout out to Lewis Hamilton doing his thing. You know?
Sade, Candace, you and I spoke about innovation and diversity.
Yeah, man. The business case for diversity, man, that is a really great point that you brought up, Mark and Melina. You know, it's definitely hugely important and definitely has been a driver, but it's not been moving things fast enough. I'll tell you that right now. Those conversations around the business value of diversity have been happening for some time. And let me just give a couple examples as to why. And I'm talking about at the highest echelons of like major public companies, they're having these quasi conversations. Hopefully that's moving along. But the reason why is because when you have all people who think similarly or pretty much alike, the company, the entity or whatever has a lot of risk. You end up having a lot of risk when you have all people in one room who think alike, all people around the table, right? And so companies are starting to wake up to that fact and, you know, realizing that, oh, right, maybe, you know, having some external perspective, having some different opinions, having some different life experiences in the boardroom or in management really does matter, because it's going to help us reduce our business risk. It's going to help us identify new trends, new culture opportunities, understand our stakeholders better, our consumers better, whatever the case may be. So that is hugely important, but it's not moving fast enough. One area where that I think truly is demonstrated is in the innovation zone, as you're saying, Jason. Like, areas of big companies where they are driving, you know, new product development, or, you know, in my world, you know, maybe identifying, trying to come up with more sustainable ways of doing things. Those are the opportunities in companies that I think, you know, oftentimes know they need external perspectives, know they need, you know, new insights at the table. And so those, I think, are, you know, areas of important opportunity that creatives in big corporations don't always have line of access in. But I think it's important to think about that. And in whatever organization you're in, identifying what's that route into the drivers of innovation for the company. And sustainability is definitely one of those key themes that drives innovation. But back to this issue around it moving slow enough, I think a part of that has to do with social capital. And you guys were talking a little bit about the talent pipeline, recruiting not being done in a way that really captures diversity. It's not only the recruiting, it's also who's interviewing, right? I mean, we could show up to interviews and not see people, right, who demonstrate that this company has any diverse folks in management, right? So that's another big issue. And I think when we do end up in internal roles, you know, Melina or Mark or Sade, whoever, you know, wherever you are, it's important to also make note of who are the internal these issues. Start to, you know, develop that network. And ultimately, you know, raise your hand. Unfortunately, you know, yeah, we hate always having to sort of be the internal educator, but I'm not just speaking about education. I'm talking about, well, you know, sometimes we also have to raise a hand to point out where we should be recruiting, to point out that, this is a program we're involved in, we'd like to, make some sort of relationship. So sometimes you're going to have to start to bring those networks in internally, because at the end of the day, they don't have our networks. That's the big problem, right? They don't have our networks, and therefore don't have the same visibility that we have into where the talent is. And I think that can definitely be a big missed opportunity, as you pointed out, Mark.
That's a super important point. Well done for talking over the mad crackle that I can hear in my ear. I don't know if anyone else can. I'm just going to point it out because it's there. But, it's exactly that. And I'm just speaking personally because I think there's so many arguments, there's so much dialogue, there's so much rhetoric, there's so much conversation, there's so much narrative in the media about this. But personally, being in a space in the last 10 months that my role in the social change ecosystem varies through the work I do. It could be being involved directly in a campaign and casting that particular film in a way that the commissioner hasn't thought about, or picking certain talking points and topics that speak more to the nuance of a slightly different generation that potentially that person doesn't know about. Sometimes it's having discussions like this, and sometimes it's about giving people who would never be in a specific room the opportunity and the tools to reach a level of seniority to thrive. And that is, for me, what I set up to do here. I think I walked into the business knowing I wasn't going to be able to shift the dial overnight. But I knew that walking in there, I was the only woman of color in my team. I often am the only woman and the only person of color, whether I'm on set, whether I'm in a boardroom, whether I'm in a meeting, whether I'm in a pitch. It's just the way that my experience has been. So for me, I immediately make it part of my agenda, because I don't see why I shouldn't, to lift as you climb, advocate for more people from my networks to come through the door. And my interview came through my access to this space came through a WhatsApp group that I was already part of. So there was already a bit of a familiar relationship there. So these people could advocate for me to get me in the room. Had I just sort of gone through a recruiter or applied differently, I don't know if that would have been the case. And I think being then responsible for building a team out, my entire team now, they're all diverse. It was never not going to be that way for me, because firstly, we work with brands that profit off of very diverse cultures. And if I looked at the brand teams, I looked at the leadership teams within the agency, I looked at the clients, I was like, we need to do better. We need to do better. And that's how you do it. You just, for me anyway, that's literally been the only way that I've seen it being done for the people that have brought me into those spaces. And it's the way that I continue to do it. And I don't really know if there is another way, but I know that that's really important. And the talent that we have brought into the business now, everybody is benefiting from.
Melina, how did you manage to bring about that change within your organization? Because that's quite a hard thing to do from the inside.
I know, I'm not quite sure how it happened. I think it was a bit of fluke. And also just a bit of, and this isn't to sound, gosh, it's difficult to say without sounding arrogant, but when you get into a position of leadership or a director level, wherever you are at a point where you can influence, you have to be really forthright, committed, and very obvious about what you're trying to do. Because I didn't hide the fact that I wanted the recruitment agency and the networks and the directors that were asking me who I would recommend. I was like, I want there to be diversity within these candidates, firstly. So I don't know if people ask that. I don't know if the people that hired me ask that question. It's like, it's important that we have diverse candidates to choose from. So that was the first thing. And secondly, it was more just, once a talent was there, it was obvious who to go with. It's not that the talent doesn't exist. So it wasn't actually that difficult, because it was also based on merit more than it was just the fact that, everyone comes from different backgrounds. But it's something that if you're confident about your approach, and I do think it's about being in those spaces and being able to thrive and being at a level of seniority. And I think that climb was really hard. But once you get there, it's kind of like, I feel like we all have a responsibility to do it.
Mhm.
And I honestly think that's the only way I've ever kind of had my introduction. So that's the way that I try and do it too.
Can I shift a little bit, Sade, in terms of architecture? Architecture seems like a very specific field in terms of, I mean, not that there isn't training in going into advertising or branding or filmmaking, obviously there is. But for some reason in my mind, it seems very specific. Mark just said, you know, if he knew that he could have a go, he would have given it a shot. I've seen Mark's drawing skills, and I can just say, you know, there's a lot of straight edges needed in that department. But can you talk a little bit about with Def Space? You were a director at Def Space. It's an architecture firm, Southeast London based, I believe. As we look at the changing landscape, what types of things might architecture firms or designers be looking at? And I quickly want to come over to Charlie in this regard, because he's working in a space that is in a lot of people's heads and a lot of people's conversations. But Sade, what thoughts do you have on that in terms of bringing people into that sector?
Okay, so my industry is an old profession that seems from the outside, actually from the inside, reluctant to diversity and inclusion. So it's very, very common that you go onto a practice's website and you might spot one person who's maybe up their different sort of career stages, but they will probably be a lot lower in the career path. So it's very much very reluctant. This year's been a very good year for shaking things up. This year, a local borough published a list of architectural practices in a very diverse borough, but did not choose a Black-led practice. And Black architects, Black-led practices were very proactive to voice their discontent about that. And that's featured in the professional journals. So it's been very good to draw attention to that. But even still, when you read below the line, like the comments, some people are in complete denial. They shift the blame to, we're not getting enough talent coming through. And there is an issue about that. There is an issue that there's some barriers to people accessing architecture education. It's a very expensive course. We make models, and a lot of it gets thrown into the waste. So there's a sustainability issue. But yeah, getting into the course, it's a very expensive course, and then it's a very long course, and you have to get experience, professional experience, doing that training. And sometimes it's really hard to get work experience, because companies are not, it's almost as though they're not used to certain type of people from certain backgrounds. So yeah, the chances of getting work in a practice can be quite difficult. So you see students dropping off at different stages of their career paths. The thing about this issue now is that with this borough, this council, is that where architecture is serving diverse communities. And this often means co-designing, really, if you want to create sustainable communities and inclusive regeneration. So it means actually that representation matters. So you can't deny the fact that you need diverse BAME-led practices in there, not just doing consultation, but also designing. So we need to be in there in the mix. So because councils cannot deny this, it's forcing a dialogue, it's forcing a conversation. And what local authorities are, I feel, doing, which is very proactive, is that they're tying it to money. They're saying that they're essentially suggesting to practices, if you want to win work, you need to collaborate with BAME-led practices. You need to have, you need to demonstrate equality, diversity, and inclusion in your team. You need to show what you do in terms of outreach work, in terms of providing work experience. going into schools to teach or to present. So you need to demonstrate social value if you really want to, you know, win contracts with us. And it's I feel like that's the only way. It's like forcing change, but it's necessary. It goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. So we can continue to have these recycled conversations, or we can actually say we're going to do this because we want to actually get this result, and we've got to force it to happen.
Mark, before I go on to you, this is sort of related, and you know, Charlie, in terms of Elephant and Castle specifically, you've just launched a space, Run.Dem.Radio, in Elephant and Castle. I've got a bit of a relationship there with Artworks that was there at that spot previously. Any thoughts on what you are doing there? Obviously, it's a radio station, and you're bringing all the Run.Dem magic to that space. But you know, can you talk about that relationship with the landlord and the conversation happening around you?
Yeah, so we are on the site of the old Aylesbury estate, which was basically redeveloped by Lendlease, who are kind of a big property developer in London. And for me, what I always say is I don't build communities anymore. I try and build movements. You know, I try and build movements because I think what happens with communities is when you don't empower that community and then you kind of withdraw your support, they are left to flounder by themselves. And you see that happen often and frequently. So the idea about being in this particular site is South London has always been a big part of my life. Elephant and Castle is part of my childhood. I think it's important to have someone in that community who understands, one, what it's like to be a community member, secondly, understands the history of the area, and thirdly, also has worked, you know, with brands before and has taken a local idea and made it global. And so it's almost what we look at with this Run.Dem.Radio project. It's like, this is a blueprint of how, an open source blueprint of how you can work in this way with this wave that is sweeping through cities. Because I feel like there is still this idea that gentrification isn't happening. Or actually there's this thing where you have third wave people who are living in an area who then complain about gentrification, not realizing that their entry into that area was also part of the gentrification, despite the fact they may have been there 20 years. You know, as someone who was moved to Old Street in 95, there were lots of people who moved in around the same time with me who were like, gentrification drove us out and so on and so forth. But I was a black guy living in Old Street in East London in 1995. Gentrification allowed that to happen, you know, because, you know, it's like when you meet people I'm 50 now, you meet people my age and who are black African guys, and you're like, what football team do you support? And people are surprised when you say Arsenal. I'm like, well, what other team could you have been supporting in the 70s? Because you weren't supporting Chelsea and you definitely weren't supporting West Ham. So, you know, so I think, you know, and I grew up in East Dulwich, and East Dulwich was next to Peckham, and it was a absolute hole in the 70s and 80s. But now it's a very lovely area. So I think gentrification is inevitable in some ways. I think there's a really interesting thing, though, that can be taken from the brownstone community in New York. And this idea that when you suddenly wake up and realize that the house that you brought cheaply, because that was the only area that your community were allowed to live in, is now worth a ridiculous amount of money, that if you sell up, you can go home to Ghana or back to Jamaica and live like a king for the rest of your life. That actually, you don't just take the first offer that comes your way, but you actually are quite selective about who you allow to take up the mantle. And that's something I've even experienced in London when I moved to East London, and, you know, East London is typically 2 up, 2 downs. You know, there's not a lot of amazing, superly massive houses or kind of, you know, crazy interiors. And I was that wave of people who couldn't afford to live in Shoreditch anymore, moved east. When you're walking into someone's house and they've been, you know, Reg was born in his house, his mum was born in his house, the grandmother was born in the house, What they don't want to hear you do is start saying, I'm taking out this wall, we're going to do this here, studio's going to go in this place is going, you know. For a long time, I just couldn't understand is why do these people not want to sell their houses to me? I'm offering them more than the asking price. And I realized it's because I was talking about my plans to change the interior. And I think communities are in the same kind of way. I think, you know, one of the things that I've learned in this process of working with this particular property developer is there's the boardroom understanding of community, and then there's the actuality of what it really means. And that's been really hard to kind of navigate in a year where brands are panicking and everyone wants everything done yesterday. You know, it's almost kind of, we went through first lockdown. As soon as the second one was opened, it was like, right, okay, all that stuff that we had on hold now needs to happen tomorrow. And I just feel with, you know, the way that we work with Run.Dem.Crew, it's kind of, we generally would have established ourselves in a space for a year before anyone actually realizes that we're actually there. But by that time, you know, we've got firm foundations and we're so entrenched in the community that, you know, we can't leave. And I think there's actually, I think one thing I would say to people who are watching this, who are doing similar kind of work is, a lot of times you create something because the mainstream will not welcome you, or you create something because there's not a space for you. Then you start working with brands or organizations that previously ignored you. And then you start changing the way that you work so that you fit more with the person who's brought you in. Yeah. And actually, I think it's really important to just maintain your independent way of thinking, because there are many different ways that you can do this type of work, you know, and there has to be diversity in the way that people do this type of work. There isn't one blueprint that works all for every project. And I think that's one of the problems that you have, where people are just like, well, it worked really well when we did that, so we're just gonna do this over here, you know. And I think it's just, you know, last thing I'll say is it's really important to keep your ear to the ground where the shifts in culture are happening. You know, when I was living when I moved to Old Street and was living in, you know, my warehouse, that was previously owned by guys who were in the garment industry who were selling up. They had all the property. Now they've been replaced by property developers. So I think one of the things I would say, you know, to people of color is like, keep your ear to the ground so you know what's happening. Read the right, you know, organizations, follow the right people, because this is how you get a jump start. You know, because I remember when Box Parks arrived and it was almost like, hold on a minute, like this spaceship just arrived on the corner of Shoreditch. Like, how did that happen? And loads of people who kind of could have been part of that process didn't even know about it until it was there. And one of my things with Run.Dem.Radio is, what I realized is if you don't get in bed with the new players, when they start making the shift, it very quickly becomes an impenetrable fortress that you can't get involved in. You know, musically, I think Boiler Room, I remember when they were like, oh yeah, we're just going to film DJs DJing in their bedroom. And I was like, why would anyone be interested in that? And then now, that's the thing, you know? So I think this idea of property developers who are, you know, who are buying up real estate, building these kind of, you know, developments, and then realizing that they need culture. Make sure you put your hand up when the helicopter's flying above and they're scoping out with the infrared, you know, so that you're involved in the conversation, because there are too many of us who try and get involved in the conversation from the outside. And I think BLM and that whole thing was a really interesting example of how you can get sucked in by low-hanging fruit. You know, so that when people meet people like yourselves who are doing this really interesting work, you know, within the companies, but I'm not you know, people aren't talking about that. You're almost seen as like, oh, you're not doing anything because you're not carrying a placard and you're not marching. And actually, I think when you're trying to dismantle the system, you got to go top, bottom, inside, out, underneath, through the sewer system. You got to get it in many, you know, when they were trying to take Godzilla out, they did it in many different ways. That's enough for me.
Thank you, Charlie. Before we go on, Mark, I want to get to you, but I just have to say a comment from a Salon favorite, Tracy Francis, who runs Women in Film and the Peckham Nunhead Film Festival, says, "Great conversation. I hope you share this with lots of creative agencies as part of their training days." And she says, "I love the film Run.Dem.Crew, excuse me, by Lena Chalcido. Did I say that right?
Yeah, you did. Yeah.
It was inspiring on so many levels. So I wanted to shout that out. Also wanted to say from Kat Lopez, who's also participated in our very first Southeast Salon. When we think and consider the idea of gentrification, it's about displacement and less about development. Does everyone deserve a nicely paved road? Yeah. Do they deserve to pay 3 times the price of their current rent for it and later have to move out? No. I think if I know Kat, she probably said hell no, but I'll just leave that hell no. That's my commentary. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Tracy. Mark, you had some thoughts from earlier. What do you got for us?
I'd like to start with what Sade said. It's quite heartening to hear, because a lot of the stuff you just mentioned is stuff that we actually looked at, myself and Jason, and we're trying to invent something that wasn't there before. Really, we know there are firms out there promoting diversity, but it's a kind of new thing. And let's be honest, until Black Lives Matter wasn't important to hardly any companies. They really weren't. It wasn't a big thing for them. Right. What I want to see is, in my work, it's about leveling the playing field. I worked in children's centres, doing family support, doing engagement, trying to get marry up organisations and services to communities. That's what I've done all along, and it's normally along health and well-being, along those lines. But what I'm trying to do now is to transfer those skills, because what I do, I'm a connector. I just put 2 people together, and sometimes person A has got no idea about how to engage with group B, so they need someone like us to come along and bridge it. I think that in a long term, because I know we're running out of time, scholarships are a way forward. Yeah, having diversity in companies is great, but you've got to have people have got to understand what the hell an architect is, first of all. Yeah, so we've got to go into schools. One of the things we're going to do with 40%, we're going to start featuring people from underrepresented industries. Our first feature is an architect who happens to be half Guyanese, half Italian, and has worked within the very big architecture practices and is now doing it on his own. So it's definitely about getting young 13-year-old kids. I want these design agencies, if they're not hiring, or architecture practices, or whatever business you are, if you're not hiring, come into those schools and develop partnerships and allow those young kids from Lambeth, from Peckham, from Forest Hill, from Sydenham to know what an architect is, to know what a design agency is, and give them an opportunity to aspire to it. Because if you don't know what it is, you're not going to have a chance to go in. And yes, local authorities are leading. Yes, the public sector is leading by example. And yes, local authorities, it's great to hear that local authorities are saying, yeah, if you're not diverse, we're not going to hire you. Yeah. Just moving on swiftly to what you said about gentrification. I forget who it was, but somebody said that artists are the stormtroopers of gentrification. So yeah, what do? You come into a crap area, you think you've done a great thing, and then you're pushed out. And it is, I remember Shoreditch before pre-Blue Note, shall we say, and you didn't go to Shoreditch. Yeah. It's gone from that to the really hit place to hang out, to the bars come in, to the people in the city want to live there because it's cool, and then they don't want those places anymore because they're too noisy. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. But it's just seizing on that capital and tapping into the expertise. There's money out. There's always money, and there's always money to be made. It's just about how you tap into that.
Thank you, Mark. One of the things that I wanted to do is before we ask everyone for parting shots, I'm conscious of time, is the very nature of the salon that I'm trying to create. And many of you realize that it was, and hopefully one day will be, an in-person event with several different offshoots in terms of skill shares, occupying spaces that we never would go into, or new venues that are just opening up, and an effort to connect the different neighborhoods of Southeast London. And in that vein, I really appreciate you guys all being on the call. But I always say that it's about the network. You know, we've done 6 of these online on different topics, from race and social justice to fine art to reopening cultural institutions to film festivals, women behind the sound. And the whole thing that I'm trying to do is to highlight different people that are doing different creative and entrepreneurial things in order to create that network. Because selfishly, living in this, being lucky enough to have lived here for over a decade in this community, we are surrounded by amazing people, amazing talent, amazing minds that are doing great things that might not have the platform. And I think it's about elevating those platforms, because let's face it, you know, there are brands and companies and corporations and the government that are coming, they're calling, you know, they're coming for us. They're coming for that talent. They need that talent. So it's about, as we've all said, opening up those search efforts, opening up the recruitment, so that, and again, back to the salon, providing this network as a clearinghouse. If somebody comes to me and says, do you know somebody that does this? I'm like, yes, you come to me, I'm going to point you over to this direction or this direction, in order to give people that, put people in that space. That's the entire, you know, reason d'etre, what I'm trying to say. That's my best French, Latin, French. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, one day we are going to get back into the physical spaces, and there's so many ideas that I've got about sharing these platforms with people. It's great to have people talking about ideas, but you know, the Zoom platform, it's a very constrained system, but I just can't wait to be back in the room and to be able to do that together. Can I just go around robin, starting with you, Candace, all the way from New York? What are some final thoughts that you have, just reflecting on the conversation? Yeah.
Wow. So we'll kind of circle back to gentrification, which just leaves a lot on my mind. But, you know, I think one thing I want to say, you know, maybe having been perhaps on that bleeding edge of the early gentrification here in Brooklyn, perhaps, without knowing it, I think one thing that we can diverse folks, multiracial folks, with our ethical lens is to think about how we're reinvesting in that community and how we, you know, help maintain ownership. Because at the end of the day, it's about whether you're, you know, an artist or, you know, some. And
Candace, I'm sorry. Candace, I'm sorry. Can I stop you and maybe unplug your headphones, because we're losing you there?
oh, okay.
If that, try that and see if it works. Apologies.
Yes.
Perfect.
It's better.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
Sorry about that. Sorry. I was just saying, you know, it's all about ownership, you know, and, you know, we need to be able to own our art, own our ideas, and own our neighborhoods, frankly, as much as possible. You know, we bring our art to our neighborhoods, and as we, you know, artists oftentimes are on that bleeding edge. I totally agree with you. But sometimes I think, you know, we have an opportunity to rethink about how artists take ownership in communities as well, and doing that in a responsible way, making sure that we engage with our neighbors and with longtime owners and residents there in whatever those new projects are that are coming online, and making sure that they have a stake and a voice in that. I think that's hugely key.
Cool. Thank you, Candace. Melina, what do you think?
I mean, I'm always just rolling off of what Candace has just said, because that's exactly it. For me, like working in social media predominantly in the last sort of 12 months of my life, the way your kind of average consumer, the way that people, businesses, brands are paying attention to social audiences and how they consume, like they talk consumers, right? Audiences, communities, whatever you want to call them, but it's cultivating energy for something that's going to essentially lead to sales, which is what we've talked about. But consumers recognize that we all have a role to play in creating the world that we want to live in. And where we're talking about, you know, brands are kind of, there's amazing brands that are Black owned, that are owned by young people, that like some of the coolest brands that I want to buy from. I'm 35 years old, but I'm like out here wanting to purchase from a young brand owner who's just set up a business on Instagram and is like, is the most incredible stuff is coming out of their platform. So I think brands need to start paying attention to what that landscape looks like, because there are so many new brand owners coming up. There are so many new people that are cultivating creativity in a really meaningful way that is going to generate way more interest than perhaps a more mainstream brand that's appropriating culture in a way that people don't appreciate anymore. Really important to pay attention to. Yeah. Then you have agencies, especially the traditional agencies, that are being priced out of the market because you've got these really cool creative cult-like collectives over here that can do everything, that are multi-potentialites, that are, again, super diverse. So there is a business need to keep up with the consumer's interests, but there's also a case for more mainstream businesses that have kind of operated in a really like nepotic way to start paying attention to how they bring talent in-house if they want to stand a chance to compete in the long term. And I think, just to finish, what are the opportunities to build agency and to enhance representation in the spaces that you occupy? Going back to that original point, it is about lifting as you climb. It is about taking responsibility for being the change that you want to see in those spaces and not being afraid to say things that perhaps, I almost challenge myself to say things that might be a bit disruptive, because it feels good and it's important. Yeah. And I don't think I've ever felt more empowered to do that. And I'm really enjoying the shift that's happening. I, again, appreciate it's going to take a long time, but I really don't want people to feel, and I don't think they do. I think the generation that's coming up behind us really are outspoken. There's a couple of incredible people, The Other Box, a great platform, a great space, which I would shout out. They're advocating for my diversity inclusion. They do like unconscious bias training in big agencies, and Serena Abassi, who's like all about equality, inclusion, and diversity. Language Matters, which is an incredible space on Instagram that discusses like problematic words. I'm never going to say, hey guys, let's have a quick powwow, because I now understand where that comes from. It's just about educating ourselves. So I could talk about it all day, but there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm for shifting the dial. So this is a great conversation to be having.
Thank you for those references, and thank you for the shout outs. Also, thank you for lifting as you climb. I think that's an incredible... T-shirts
are being printed tomorrow.
Right, they're already being done in the back.
I hope you haven't trademarked it.
Sade, what do you think? Parting shots for us.
I think it's interesting that we're picking up on gentrification and regeneration and displacement. There's certain things that are, unfortunately, because I don't want to get very in depth about this, but there's certain things about market forces that you can't really. I mean, you need a sort of political will to really kind of address market forces. But in terms of what local authorities and local governance and designers can do, it's really about including communities and making sure, as Candace said, the voices are heard and that they're part of the conversation, the dialogue. It's often sort of thrown around that communities are hard to reach. Actually, it's not that. It's that we need to actually go and, engage. And also, when we ask communities to engage, that's their time. So if we need to pay them, that needs to happen. So I'm interested in this sort of how we can sort of limit displacement that happens during regeneration, because I'm part of that as a profession. That's part of my work, and you can't, as Charlie said, you just can't stop changes happening in places, because there needs to be urban renewal. But how do you do that so that everyone is taken along on this journey, so that it's not just about who can afford to stay, who can afford to move in and enjoy the very sort of beautiful places that we're creating.
Thank you, Sade. Thank you very much. Mark, any parting shots, ideas?
I came into this not really knowing anybody on this Zoom today. Charlie, I'm aware of what you do, but everybody else in the room is a stranger to me, of course, apart from Jason. it's quite heartening to see that there are people with similar ideas, and a lot of conversations, a lot of things that we're each saying are resonating for each other. I think that the salon is proven to be a really valuable thing, because it allows people who are on the same page but maybe not working in the same building or the same city potentially to say, oh, okay, so it's not, it doesn't mean it has to be you standing in the corner going, or quietly, you know, chatting to your colleague about why this isn't right. You can actually see now that there are people out there with the same ideas. It's just about creating those connections. This has been quite heartening for me, because it's I go through my ups and downs in terms of confidence about what I'm doing and whether it's relevant. And when I hear people saying the same words and phrases that I've been using, it's like, oh, okay, so I'm not alone here. So yeah, it's been great. You know, thanks, and you know, you'll hear from me.
Thank you, Mark. Charlie, you got the last word.
That's not safe to give me the last word.
Well,
what I will say to people is, you know, obviously this year has been an upside down year, and the lead up to it, I think, has been quite hard as well. But I actually think when the world reopens again, there's actually healing to be done once people stop pointing and shouting at each other. I think that this type of work that, you know, architecture, culture, you know, it's advertising, that's all part of the healing process. It's a way of bringing people together. And I think that actually people need to remain positive about the future, and to look at this period of time as like, this is a time when when you're almost preparing yourself so that when the world reopens, you're ready to thrive. You know, and as someone who lived through, you know, Thatcher's 80s, where it seemed so bleak and there was absolutely no hope, what I do realize is that suddenly it was almost like the sun suddenly woke up. And actually what people realize is you can do a lot with a small amount, you know, and you can do a lot cleverly with little space. Yeah. And actually, I think that what we are, you know, I'm really excited to see, you know, the new people who are going to be coming out and being part of the conversation and filling in the, you know, the space that has been created by the events of this year. Yeah. So I'm really positive about the future. I'm just like, wicked, great. Let's go again. You know, another 10 years of amazing music to come out, amazing architecture, amazing culture, a cultural shift. I'm there for it. Totally. Definitely.
Thank you, Charlie. I mean, I feel like we've already seen that in terms of not only the culture and the music output, the artistic output, people are responding to what's going on, but I'm also very fascinated with spaces, space activation. Next summer is going to be like Christmas. We're going to figure out how to be outside. We're going to figure out how to be in open air spaces. We're going to figure out how to be in all these spaces that previously were office blocks with, you know, cubicles that are going to be empty. The developers are not going to know what to do to fill them, but we've got some ideas. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. And really quickly, Charlie Dark, Run.Dem.Crew, Run.Dem.Radio. You can find him on Saturday from 1 p.m.
12 p.m. we're on.
12 p.m. Brand new venture down in Elephant and Castle. Sade Abdul from Deft Space. Mark James, 40% London, 40% LDN on the number 40% LDN on Instagram. Candace Hewitt. We don't have any links for you, but unless you've got something you can share with us. Actually, Ubiquita worldwide, but you know, I'll let you speak.
CandaceHewitt.com.
Okay, fantastic. Melina Pone, Melina Makes on Instagram, Melina_Makes on Instagram. Did I get that right? Okay, fantastic. I want to say thank you guys, and
I want to say thank you to you, Jason, because this is really important. This kind of work, this space is very important, and I know that you are a alchemist in terms of connecting people. And we talked before about bringing people together, walking away 20 minutes later, and then, you know, a whole new universe has been created just from thought and ideas, and that is what we're all missing at the moment. I think it's fundamentally, we talk about environment and yes, innovation and all these new things that we're going to be doing, but fundamentally we're all feeling othered at the moment because we're all going through like challenging who we are. And you've just reminded me in even making some notes about how I wanted to speak today, about what I've spent the last year of my life doing and why it matters.
Yeah.
So that's really important. And also just because you haven't stopped and you've been consistent, and that's really important. And this space is really important. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Folks like you make it easy. I'd also like to say thank you to Galina Wren from Upper Norwood Library Hub, who's helping us out tonight with production. And that's it. That's all I got. You guys enjoy your week. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Cheers.
Okay.